But tonight we are talking about the Signs Gospel. And this is one that I've had a couple people just ask me multiple times, what are we talking about? What Signs Gospel? Not something that people are necessarily completely aware of, although it's not a particularly new idea. It's just maybe one that isn't particularly well known. And so I think it's something that is going to have some interest. So just by way of stepping back and having a background, so we know that in the Christian portion of the Bible, the New Testament, that it's not simply something that somebody sat down, Jesus didn't sit down and start writing and then made a book, or composing in the same way that the Quran is simply one, one prophet involved in the composition of the book or in the relation of the book. In this case, there's actually multiple different authors and multiple different texts that got put together into the New Testament. And what we aren't always aware of is that there's so many other books that are quite similar to the ones that made it in that did not make it in. And so they're what we sometimes think of as lost gospels or lost other texts that are like the different texts in the New Testament. And another thing that is often not widely understood is just the extreme length of time before there really was a canon, how long it took before there actually, when people say, well, isn't it just always in the Bible, or what the early Christians were doing with the Bible? The early Christians didn't have like a Bible in a combined canon. They had lots of these texts which individual communities considered scripture, but it wasn't just like one list or all published together the way we have it now. So the very first time anybody really got going with a list of a canon is actually this leader, Marcion, who is not an Orthodox guy. So he represents a Christian community that the people who ended up winning in the fight, inter-Christian fights, considered to be a heretic. So they would call Marcion a heretic. We might say he's heterodox, is maybe a nicer way to say now. But anyway, so he had a different idea about how he believed Christianity should be. And so he did this thing where he took 11 books and said that these are the only books that should be considered valid for Christianity. And so he knocked out a whole bunch of different stuff. He especially liked Paul, and he especially, for his gospel, he liked Luke. He didn't like the other ones. But he also took some things off of Luke, so he didn't like the Christmas story, for example. And so essentially it's a very sparse canon that had a very particular, reflected his particular theology. The neat thing that happened is, though, once you make an idea like that, then everyone's like, oh, well, we should have a list of what the books that we think are the right books, And so once the idea gets going, then everybody starts going on it. And so then there's different early collections then in the next couple centuries that include different books, a bunch of which have been omitted from the final canon as we have it. And so it's not until the year 367 AD or CE that the final 27 books, as we kind of now have the New Testament in a list, first appear. And this is just in a list that a bishop, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, he wrote a letter. And yet, even though he's now kind of has asserted that this is the canonical list, it's not that like everybody agrees with him. It's just what this particular very important bishop had to say. So that's the first time we see the present-day canon even talked about altogether. Later that century, Augustine, who is so important to know, we always come back to Augustine, he leads a church council, a synod, in his hometown, or the town where he is a bishop, which is called Hippo, which is essentially North Africa in the area that's now Algeria, Tunisia. This area, of course, had been a major Christian center before the rise of Islam. And so Augustine leads a synod there, and there's also then subsequently at councils in Carthage, which is that same territory, in 397 and 419. They also then accept that canon list. And so then by the time, while that's going, the contemporary Pope, Damasius, commissions a translation. All of these texts are written in Greek. All the people in the West only speak, are mostly now only speaking Latin. Greek is falling out of use as the empire is becoming monolingual. So when Damasius commissions Jerome to translate the whole thing into Latin, the canon that they pick are those same 27, But even though that becomes the canon in the West, people in the East still have a bunch more books because, again, they're all written in Greek, and so they have access to all the ones that they want. And it is really only in the 5th century that the Eastern churches actually agree to the canon as we now have it. And the last book that anybody let in was Revelation. Elizabeth.
I'm just going to do so. This is all.
Oh, is this microphone on?
Oh, sorry. There you go. I was just picking a nit or two about the picture.
Yeah.
It's obviously not contemporary. I mean, look at the embroidery.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we just don't always have. Yeah, so sometimes.
Don't have a photo.
We don't have photos, but unfortunately, we also don't have good contemporary portraits usually. And so, Augustine is a guy who, I mean, will use these late Romantic and also Renaissance portraits. I don't ever know which ones I'm throwing in on. Anyway, you're right. I've got, there's Michelangelo's portrait again. It's also late and not very accurate looking. So, okay. So
I can't remember. Somebody was, I think this was a Hollywood guy. He wanted a picture of Christ, and somebody, of course, sent him one. Well, that's very nice, but don't you have a photograph? I'm not making this up.
And we wonder why Hollywood is full of inaccuracies. It's because no one's able to supply them with the photos that they need to get it right. Okay, so if we take then those 27 books and we look at them by length, and so starting kind of the traditional order up there on the clockwise from 12 o'clock going around, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Gospels, Acts, then all of these letters, and then the book of Revelation. Those are kind of how the length of the whole thing goes. And so we can kind of see that in yellow, Paul, who is the big letter writer, is kind of the largest writer that we have and also the earliest. And then the orangish ones are the ones that are attributed to Paul, so people writing later in Paul's name. And then the next biggest author is the author of Luke Acts, who's the same author. It's a 2-part book. But then we have texts, the Gospel of John and 3 letters of John, and also the book of Revelation, which is also said to be written by a John of Patmos. But anyway, it's sometimes people think it's the same John, but anyway, it's clearly a different John. Anyway, there are different texts that are part of this John corpus of text within the New Testament. Okay, so essentially what we end up with in the canon as we now have it is 4 types of books. So Gospels, which are essentially, the word means good news, but it's essentially a theological texts that the different evangelists or gospel writers are writing not to tell a history, they're not histories, not to write a biography of Jesus, there's very few life details, but rather in order to have their different theological goals of what they would like to have accomplished. The book of Acts, which is the Luke's sequel to the Gospel. There's actually, what we'll mention here is there's actually plenty more of these other types of books, although there's only 4 Gospels that make it in. There's lots of Gospels that don't make it in. There's only one book of Acts, which is to say, this is meant to be, it's more of a history, but it's also, again, a theological history. The idea of it is, it's Acts of the Apostles, but the idea of how did we go from a crisis, essentially this moment where there had been this Jesus movement, the man is crucified, there's visions then afterwards of his resurrection. How do you go from this moment when the Romans have essentially suppressed the thing to where the church really takes off and grows all around? And so the story there that the author of Luke Acts provides is the book of Acts that we have. Then these kind of letters that different authors have written to different Christian communities for different purposes. And then finally, there's an apocalypse that makes it in, and we tend to think of the apocalypse of John as being like the apocalypse, but in fact, it's actually a large body of literature. There's all kinds of apocalypses, almost all of which don't make it in. But anyway, that one made it in. So if we kind of take those groupings and we look at kind of the approximate, and all of these dates are very approximate, and so you can't say for sure that any of these dots are going to be in the right place, but I'm just giving it to you for kind of give you a sense of them. But essentially, if we take that first century or so, first 2 centuries here of the Christian era, we take the earliest texts, the Christian texts that we have, which are these letters, the authentic letters from Paul, beginning with 1 Thessalonians and down to Romans, which is the last one that he would have written. Then the other letters that are written in Paul's name, and then we also are looking at some of the other different texts that we had, letters of James and Jude, the letter of Hebrews, then the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and John, and so on, right? With maybe the last one of them getting written there, maybe being 2 Peter, maybe. So those are essentially how the books that made it into the canon. You forget about Timothy? Timothy's right there, Timothy. And so those are attributed to Paul, but almost certainly not written by Paul.
Oh, so, and what about just the color codes there?
So the color codes going back, I was doing things like, I think they're Gospels, letters, Acts, and Apocalypse, and the difference, and then further divided here into whether they were authentic letters of Paul or not. And so I'm dividing the ones that scholars agree are authentic anyway, ones that are disputed, and ones that are mostly people agree are not written by Paul.
Pastor, do you want us to remember all this after?
There will be a test. There will be a test. So yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have those, and I mentioned there's plenty more, right? So we have, for example, all of these. So then there's lots of other texts that don't make it in, right? And a lot of these I have here are, let's say, hypothetical texts or texts that have been lost, and so that, or texts that have been later edited, and so we don't have them. So some of these early ones, like Q, or maybe an earliest version of Thomas as opposed to the Thomas that we actually have, may be a very early text. Same thing, like, for example, I'm showing here like an early Didache, and then the Didache that we have. And then, for example, here also in that early category here is this Signs Gospel, which is also, again, one of these lost ones. And then the Gospel that we actually have, which is John, right? So yeah, all on the test. Make sure you got this down. Are you ready? Okay, slides over. Okay. We can come back to that one. So I want to talk then about this Signs Gospel that is the overall topic here. So the existence of a Signs Gospel is first proposed by a German theologian and biblical scholar, Rudolf Bultmann, in 1941. So this is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. And there have been plenty of additional scholars who have followed up on the idea and have, not all of the Bultmann's ideas are current anymore. So a lot of his arguments have maybe, people have argued against them in all kinds of different ways, but then there's new arguments by new scholars, for example, Raymond Brown, Robert Fortna, who have additional hypotheses and have also attempted to reconstruct the text so that we can actually look at what it's about. And then further, the next step after also with reconstructing it is trying to understand who the author of this lost text is, and specifically also who they're writing to. Because one of the things that we don't always think about when we think of these texts, we think of the audience as being us. But in fact, no matter how much, for example, everybody today tends to think of the book of Revelations as having been written, to them and to only being about predictions of things that are happening in the past 20 years and the next 10, as they tend to think of it. In fact, it's actually written to people 2,000 years ago, and specifically referring to events back then, as opposed to events now. And so in that same exact way, all of the different writers are writing to people in their immediate community. And so one of the things that we can find out then about that community, since otherwise nothing is in general known, is we have to kind of, through our looking at the text, determine what the beliefs, values, characteristics, maybe even the location of the community is based on the clues that the text itself gives us. So I was going to have this at the podium. I've got this over there in the other room. So one of the places you can get it, and it's a neat book that is just fun to have for all of the different texts that it includes, is a book edited here. Where is it? Robert Miller is the editor. It's called The Complete Gospels. And so that's one of the places where you can get a copy of the reconstructed text. and I'm quoting a lot from that. They're taken, this one, the version that's in this text is taken from Miller's text. This is Miller's text. It's largely based on Fortn's text, the fourth gospel and its predecessors. So again, these aren't new ideas. So that's a 40-year-old book, right? So no manuscript of the Science Gospel survives. We should, again, caution everybody to know this is a literary reconstruction that scholars in the past half century or more have made based on this hypothetical early source. The complete Gospels doesn't only include these hypothetical ones. It does include hypothetical ones like Q and the Science Gospel, but it also, for example, includes little one-paragraph papyrus or whatever that people have found from an unknown gospel that's otherwise lost. And then also examples that we would have are ones that have been lost, but that ancient writers were quoting because they opposed it. They believed that the heretics had written it, and so they'll make a long quote out of it to tell us what used to be written in there. And so then we can essentially take those quotes and we can kind of see what the text was about. But we only have the negative opinion about it in those cases. So what was this gospel about? So there's all kinds of different ways. I mentioned that gospels are not the same as biographies. We have a kind of a sense in the four canonical gospels of it being specifically about a ministry or active career of Jesus that involves usually him doing teachings, him performing acts, and ultimately him being crucified and resurrected. But they are not all that way. So one of the ones that we've had a lecture before on Q, which is the hypothetical sayings gospel, that we theorize or think is likely that the authors of Matthew and Luke used to create their gospels, or Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas, which had been lost for thousands of years but was recovered in Nag Hammadi in the middle of the 20th century in Egypt and was subsequently translated from Coptic. So that gospel has almost no narrative elements. There's almost no storyline to it, and instead it'll just begin, Jesus said, and then it'll give a saying, or the apostles will ask something or other, and then Jesus will reply to that. And so in general, that's how the sayings gospel works. There are, in a case of Q and Thomas, little episodes, but they're generally speaking to set up a saying. Okay, so unlike that, unlike sayings gospels, signs gospel is almost entirely narrative, and there's almost no sayings. So you can imagine that already, if people are making those kind of recordings, you imagine that the early Christian communities are already having differences of opinion about what was the significance of Jesus' life and ministry, right? So if you were having a sayings gospel where you're not recording anything, for example, about Jesus' narration of a death or a resurrection or anything, you're just doing teachings, then you maybe are coming from a community that is envisioning Jesus as being an important, great teacher, and that the important things is to follow these kind of teachings, right? Whereas if you're from a community, for example, that doesn't record any teachings, maybe you don't think that the teachings are as important, right? And so there might be something else. So the story is more important in the case of a narrative gospel like the science gospel. So the text, as we find it, is consisting primarily of a series of acts that are performed by Jesus, which are described by its author as signs, and signs that have a particular purpose. And so this is an interesting difference in the use of words as opposed to what we have in the Synoptic Gospels. So the Synoptic Gospels are the first three canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In the Synoptic Gospels, when they tell stories like this, Jesus is performing miracles, which is in Greek, the original Greek here, dynames, whereas the Science Gospel uses a different word, and so they're using semia, which is to say signs. And so this is already kind of highlighting then the author's different agenda. A person that may be performing miracles for all kinds of reasons. It may be because it's a good act. Maybe you're healing let's say, the blind in order to the blind can actually see, and that may well just be the purpose is to show that miracle is actually for the purpose of actually helping the person, right? or it may well be that by cleansing leopards or other people who have consistent medical issues, a woman who has a medical, a blood issue, and is therefore not allowed to be in the society because of ritual impurity. So then it's a gospel of where you're taking all the people who are excluded from the community, and your gospel is to bring all of those people ritually into community. So the community no longer expels people for those kind of ritual impurities. So that could be what a miracle might be for, right? A sign, however, is for something else. It's not for the person necessarily that's cured. It's rather to signify something, right? And so specifically, the author of the Signs Gospel actually writes out what that agenda is, where he says, these signs, that author says, are written down so that you will come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, which is the same word as the anointed or the Christ, that Jesus is the Christ, God's Son. So that's the goal of the author here. These signs are proofs, as far as this author is concerned, miraculous occurrences, but are done for that significance. Okay, so let's go look at a little bit of the text, some of the Signs Gospel text. So the first one of these, there was a wedding at Cana, and the mother of Jesus was there. So in the Signs Gospel and in, actually also in the whole expansion in John, Jesus' mother is a character who appears many times, but she's never named. So from the other Gospels, we have the sense that her name is Mary, right? That's not necessarily known to the Signs Gospel writer, or they certainly don't include that information. So the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were standing 6 stone water jars, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim, and he said to them, "Now drain some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it, and when the steward tasted the water, it had become wine. The steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine afterwards, after the guests have become drunk, but you have kept the good wine until now." So not only has he turned all this water into wine, it's also like vintage stuff, right? Anyway, then it concludes, though, and this is emphasis mine, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, and his disciples believed in him. So essentially this is setting up the narrative component of the Signs Gospel, a sign, and then we also have the explanation of what the sign is for. In this case, the disciples are believing in Jesus, but also, in other words, ultimately, as we see in the conclusion, that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ. So the next sign that happens is a healing at a distance. The son of an official in Capernaum. And after that healing takes place, the author says this was the second sign that Jesus performed. When we finish that one, the next one, when the disciples are having no luck fishing, they're out in the Sea of Galilee, Jesus tells them to cast their nets onto the other side of the boat, and then when that happens, there's just a multitude of fish, and the author here says there's 153 fish. And the author then says, this was the third time Jesus showed himself to the disciples. So you can kind of get the sense here that there's an underlying idea of signs, and also that the author's kind of ticking them off, right? And so when we get to, I won't go through them all, but when we get to it, essentially the Signs Gospel is recording 7 kind of major signs. So the water into wine, the healing of the official son, the huge catch of fish as we saw, those ones. Then the feeding of the 5,000, which is to say the miracle of the loaves, multiplying the loaves and fishes. Thrown in for good measure, but just part of the same story, since that was taking place next to the Sea of Galilee. He walks on the water on the way back home from that. So that's an extra one. Anyway, then raising of Lazarus from the dead. So Lazarus, who had already, they've been wanting to heal, but he died before he got there. And he is raised from the dead, and then a blind man is given sight, and a crippled man is healed. So, again, these are all then supposed to be signs that Jesus is the Messiah, and ultimately, symbolically here, especially the raising from the dead, is prefiguring, Jesus' own resurrection from the dead, right? So triumph over death as the Messiah. So then from that point, then there's a part 2 of this hypothetical text, which is a passion and a resurrection story. And we'll get to that. I'll just mention then that especially a couple of these ones that are fairly famous Jesus stories. So the turning water into wine one, you probably heard that story, even if you're not particularly up on your Christian Bible. And also probably Lazarus come forth, the idea of Lazarus being a guy who is resurrected. Those don't exist in the rest of the canonical Gospels. So those stories are in this particular source text, and then as it continues in John alone. So, continuing then, some of the reconstructions, some of the scholars say, okay, well, the whole thing was the signs part, but most of the scholars who are following and believing that trying to make the case for a signs gospel think that that's only the first half, and the second half of the signs narrative is in fact a passion narrative, which is, it's a Christian word for the Easter narrative, or the narrative of all the events leading up to Jesus' execution, crucifixion, and resurrection, right? So the passion narrative. So in the Synoptic Gospels, when we're in Matthew, Mark, Luke, the triggering event that begins the passion, essentially when he's getting in bad with the Roman and Judean officials that are in Jerusalem, is this going to the temple and turning over all of the money changers' tables and that kind of thing, and that's showing essentially revolutionary or just worse, destruction of property intent. When property is important, in civilization. So that kind of gets everything rolling for the crucifixion. That is not the case in the fourth gospel, which is to say the Gospel of John, so the non-synoptic gospel. In that case, that particular episode is recounted, but it's thrown way earlier in the chronology. So it's maybe a couple years before the Passion story, and so therefore is not the triggering event at all. Instead, this fourth gospel, and then also the reconstructed signs gospel, the thing that triggers the Passion story, or the thing that triggers the officials to want to go after Jesus in the signs gospels, maybe not surprisingly, is the fact that he's doing all these signs. And so this is a reason why it does kind of make sense that this Passion story is also related to is also a part of this earlier signs gospel. So we're quoting them from this. The ranking priests called the council together and said, "This fellow performs many signs." This keeps happening. There's a lot of signs here. That's 7 signs. If we let him go on like this, everybody will believe him. And he says, then the Romans will come and destroy our nation. So this is a very different motive, let's say, that's attributed quite obviously ex post facto or retroactively to the council here in Jerusalem. That's based on the fact that that ultimately the temple and Judea and everything is destroyed by the Romans, right? But it's not because of Jesus potentially leading a revolution, throwing over money tables, maybe appearing as a king, entering the city on Palm Sunday, to the acclaim of the crowds or whatever that triggers it in the Synoptic Gospels. Rather, it's all these signs. The problem is all these signs are going to prove to everybody that Jesus really is the Messiah, and that's going to make it be a mess because the Romans aren't going to like that, and so they're going to come and wipe us out. So thereafter, there follows a complete passion narrative, and there's a bunch of overlaps in this with the passion narrative that we also have in the Synoptic Gospels, the basis of which is Mark. So last year we did a pretty long lecture at Easter about Mark's passion narrative and maybe what the sources of that were and how that was possibly constructed. There has got to be some kind of, scholars aren't sure what to make of this. There's either a lot of them feel that there's some kind of pre-existing passion tradition that is being passed around somewhere, or if Mark, as some people think, is the earliest passion narrative, then that's been spread around, and people are reacting to that and telling the story in different ways. There's too many overlaps for it the different details to not be known, but they are not literarily dependent. So unlike what we have with the Synoptics, where we know very much, it's just clear that there's a literary dependency, which is the way it's explained is that Matthew has Mark's text and is literally copying and correcting it and adding it into his own gospel. We don't have that apparently with this text, so maybe the person has heard it and has heard it read somewhere, and then they didn't like it because a lot of people don't like Mark's gospel. Luke didn't like Mark's gospel. Matthew didn't. And so maybe the author here also has aware of it, doesn't like it, and is writing it the way they understood it in their own tradition, or however we understand it to happen. Anyway, there's weird and interesting overlaps. But one of the differences that's quite interesting is the episode that's fairly famous. In Mary Magdalene, in all the different accounts, is among women that are the first to be aware of the empty tomb and to see messengers or angels who are saying that Christ is risen. But in this case, there's an episode that's fairly famous of Mary in the garden. She meets somebody wandering in the garden who she assumes is the gardener, but then it turns out is actually Jesus, and so she's the first to see the risen Christ in kind of that way. And so that's a little bit different episode in this particular Passion narrative. So the text then of the Signs Gospel concludes, although Jesus performed many more signs for his disciples to see than could be written down in this book, these are written down so you will come to believe that Jesus is the Anointed, the Messiah, the Christ, God's Son. Those are synonyms, right? I'm just translating it in multiple ways. So that's kind of a summary. I wanted to get that out, ahead first, because a lot of times I give you so much context, you think, well, what happened about the Signs Gospel? So we actually, in this case, I put the horse up first, and now we can get to cart. So here we go. So how do we get this thing? So where did we get this hypothetical source? So I want to give a little bit more background about, just to remind us about ancient manuscripts and how text tradition works in antiquity. So obviously, before we had the printing press, all texts had to be copied by hand. So that's very well known, but it's what people don't think about. I mean, we might think about if you tried to write out a book, paper's super cheap and stuff like that. It wasn't back then, all the different ways they could have. It's a long, expensive process. It's performed by a class of trained professional scribes. It's like a job that people would have. There could be low scribes and high scribes. So there's some scribes that are very powerful and important, and some that are much cheaper to do stuff with. But in any case, it's still part of the elite.
Is that like a wax tablet that the Romans used to, and you could write a message on it and close it up and send it to somebody, and then they could scrape it off and write another message. Yeah. Texting.
Yeah, it's like Roman texting, yeah. So even the texting was tough, right? But it was it was slow because the tablet here is like transported by a slave probably, so it's a person running across the city or something like that as opposed to the internet. So yeah, that's how, so the different kinds of writing, right? So for all of these cases then there's a relative difficulty in copying a text. So it's not like, going to your Xerox machine and just printing off more, or going to you don't even need a printout anymore, right? You just take a file and you email it to each other, right? And so now the copying is nothing. And actually the writing is a lot harder. Back then, writing it all out is almost just as hard as writing more, right? And so as a result of that, it was a lot easier to, given how hard each individual copy you're making, it's a lot easier to simply modify the text as you're making a new copy, right? And so one of the things that scribes frequently did is if you have like a book like this, an important book in your library, as you're reading along, you may well make a bunch of different notes, especially as the book starts to get older and out of date, or it maybe is using a bunch of words, and you're like, well, what does that word mean? And you might write down a synonym for it, or you might write an explanation for something that seems like, hey, that's not how I understand the story, so you might write like, well, he doesn't really mean that, he means this. And so they'll write those kind of things in the margins and also between the lines like that. And so these are called glosses. And so then once you have a book, let's say, now you have a book that has all these glosses, and the guy making the glosses has died. now you have that book, and you're going to make a copy of your book for the other scribe who comes by who wants a copy for their community, their library. Well, they may well think the glosses are just as important or just as useful, and they may well just copy, when they're copying the new one in, just insert all those glosses right into the text. So the new text, there won't be any particular, in terms of the writing or the epigraphy, there won't be any particular notation that shows that this gloss wasn't part of the original text. You won't know what the original was and what isn't. So the only way we can tell that is through teasing it out through literary criticism. You say, it may well be this happens, for example, in a letter of Paul, he's talking about one particular topic, then suddenly there's just this completely unrelated thing using all kinds of vocabulary that Paul never uses, and it's actually contradictory to everything he always says for 2 paragraphs, and then it goes right back to the same thing that he had just been talking about. And so when that happens, what it does look like happened is accidentally a little couple paragraphs got inserted in, and that's where that comes from. So the glosses could go in and be interpolated or inserted into the text without us seeing where any of those seams are. Another way that happens, like I'm just talking about with Paul here, sometimes a scribe might have a really good little thing that they have just one page. You have a book, and then somebody gives you a little one-pager that has another little episode or story or list of sayings that you really like. And the way things work, I have a library here with bookshelves and things like that. There's a lot of those books have a thing like that, and because a piece of paper isn't as likely to be saved, we also have filing cabinets, so we do save the papers too. But a lot of times people stick those in the book, right? And then you close it up and it's in there with the book. And so what will happen then is a little page like that will get in there, and so then, again, when you make a copy, they may well just see that as being relevant or part of it, and it might just get inserted right in, like, for example, where that page made. And so to preserve the short text, it's kept together with the long work. Sometimes it's deliberately inserted, so sometimes is actually making a copy because they want to put that in. So for example, so this is one of the most famous examples. Oh, there's a question. Can we get this to Joseph?
The slide before that one.
Yeah.
What is that document there? Also.
So that document is a single papyrus sheet from a New Testament. It's a Greek text, and it's not one of these pericopes that's a freestanding one. It's just a gospel text from the New Testament. It's part of the regular text. I just used it as an example. Here's a page that's free floating, But we don't have. So we usually, the problem with almost all of this literary criticism is that we don't usually have the independent example of the free floating thing floating around. We only have it embedded in the text as we already have it, and so we have to kind of tease it out ourselves. But I'm trying to make it visual, so I'm just kind of picturing it for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. So this is maybe an example. It's not everybody's convinced. A lot of people argue that it's not one of the free floaters, but a lot of people think it is. So there's reasons for it. So when you've got a little tiny passage, it's called a pericope. And so anyway, that's just a word that means a little free floater passage here, right? Or it doesn't have to be free floating, a little passage. So in Gospel of John, as we right now have it, chapter 7 to chapter 8, we read, "Then each of them went home, while Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before them, they said to him, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now the law, Moses, commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?' They said this to test him, so that he might have some charge so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'Let any among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her.' And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. And Jesus straightened up and said, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' And she said, 'No one, sir.' And he says, 'Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on do not sin again.'" Yeah, there's a...
Well, to my ear and eye, that sounds like a well-crafted story that flows together well.
Yes.
What would be the indications that this was an insertion?
Yeah, exactly. So here, this is a great story, right? And so it's also one of the best stories, I'd say. So this is a wonderful story, like Yvonne is saying. So here we have Jesus arguing against literal interpretation of Scripture, against religious judgmentalism. He's arguing instead in favor of empathy, mercy, inclusion, for example. The problem here, and so what's the idea? This pericope is not found in many of our earliest and best manuscripts of the four Gospels. So some of the very earliest, or actually lots of the earliest versions of the Gospel of John just go right from the verses right before it, right to the verses after it, and it's not there. Other ones, some other earlier ones, do that same thing, and then this place where it traditionally exists or is found in some of the later, or in the traditional way that the gospel is, instead it's found in a different location in the Gospel of John. So it's been inserted in a different place than its traditional location, and it's occasionally found inserted into Luke. So you find the same exact story written the same exact way, and it's right after in an early manuscript of Luke, or not that early, but anyway, in a manuscript of Luke, and then that page has made its way in, and it's now a part of Luke's gospel. And so the idea here then is not that the story itself isn't a coherent story. It is. It's its own coherent story, or maybe it's its own, essentially, one little gospel of itself, the gospel of the woman taken in adultery. Or it's possibly, another possibility is it's from a gospel that has otherwise been lost. So I think that, I'm trying to think if it's the Ebionite gospel, but one of the early writers says that there's this story that exists in the gospel that's found among the Ebionites or something like that. So maybe it's from that, and the whole rest of that gospel's been wiped out and lost largely, but this one, I don't know. I think that one's unlikely. But anyway, it may well be its own little free-floating thing then, and has gotten inserted in, and so that's the idea. Not that it's not a great story. And so in fact, actually, that's what I'm saying, is literary criticism doesn't make this story invalid, but it just means that it maybe has a different history than the whole rest of the Gospel of John, and at some point or other it got to join the rest of it. And so there's questions. So Jane first, and then Urgent. Jane first.
Is it quite likely that the story might have been inserted by the scribe himself? Were they equally educated, or had as much status as the priests and so on?
So yeah, it's quite likely that what I'm arguing is that the most likely thing, as far as scholars are concerned, is that as opposed to a complete editor who has completely changed a text, Urgent was actually going to comment next, and so right, and then Yvonne, and so then as opposed to a complete revision, what essentially, like you're saying, is that this idea is there's one scribe who's making a copy at some point or other, and they inserted it in, and it.
It's a very good story to illustrate.
Yeah, and I don't think that the scribe necessarily made it up. It's its own little free-floating text, and it's wonderful, and the scribe likes it, and maybe it had been in the book with the rest of everything else, and then they just, in the very next copy, when the scribe makes that copy, that text got included in the text, and it ends up being a very influential copy, because then the other ones are copied from that, right?
But the scribe is never given the credit.
The scribes don't get credit for that. Scribes never get credit. So it's very rare, it's almost, we have to come up with, because for one thing, for almost none of these texts, we don't have any of the earliest texts. We have no original texts at all, of anything in the Bible. So there's no original texts, and we have only copies of copies, and some of them are quite early. So for example, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that has gotten us 1,000 years earlier or something like that in terms of some of these, the earliest manuscript copies, but they're still vastly far removed from the originals. Likewise here, we have surprisingly early fragments of the Gospel of John, so in the 2nd century, but in any event, we don't have anything like an autograph, and so we don't have anything like the first copy where the scribe first put this in. So, and the scribe doesn't get credit. So Urgent.
In this story, always be wanting and want to ask you the connection between the Old Testament. Adultery is made not with one person, but with two persons. Why is the lady brought up to be stoned and not the man?
Yeah. So boy, wouldn't fair play be nice if they brought the man? It's unfortunately, I feel like that. I mean, this is what happens, right? So, I mean, it's like people. Why did Monica Lewinsky's life get ruined for all of time, right? So she's had to write about that, where she's pretty much, she has infamy. I think she moved to Europe. She did everything she has had to try to recover like anything like a normal life, but instead she has this kind of mega celebrity because of this thing. And Bill Clinton largely got his reputation rehabilitated, at least for a while. He's kind of back in the doghouse again more recently, for all this stuff in the whole Me Too and everything like that. But for a whole long time he was back rehabilitated, and she hasn't been able to. So why do women get the short end of this stick? I mean, this is patriarchy, right?
In the Old Testament, is it the man and female has to be stoned, or just the lady, or how is it? How is the rule in the Old Testament?
They're both, right? Yeah. So I think that this is. I'd have to look it up. It's referring either to Deuteronomy or Leviticus, and I didn't go back and read the actual quote, but it is they're referring to a specific law, and I think they're both supposed to be stoned, but they for whatever reason, they just brought the woman. So, and did you want to comment specifically on that?
I have an answer to it.
Okay, so Tim, and then we'll get to Yvonne. I'm sorry, Yvonne. There's specifically related.
If you can take the law of Athens, we studied it when we were studying Aristotle, the law for adultery in Athens, or in antiquity at that time, specifically says that it was against the law, I think it was for a man to have sex with someone's mother or married spouse. So you could have sex with somebody as long as the woman wasn't a widow or something like that, and it wasn't related. So it had to do with who was considered to be a citizen. So you could rape or have adulterous affairs with a slave that didn't meet the bar of adultery.
Right?
Yeah. So the law for adultery specifically related to the unmarried mother, currently not a widow, and sister and wife.
But I'm not sure if that is entirely the same in Levitical law and as Greek law.
Just an example.
Yeah, as an example. But so I agree. So there's also, even in Levitical law, there's also going to be concubinage, and so the men are always going to have an outlet, and women absolutely not. So the whole societies are patriarchal, and they're about controlling women's sexuality, and so. But the idea here of this story, by contrast to the rigid law and patriarchy in the society, is that he's essentially saying, let's treat this case instead with empathy, and we're not going to just simply do this kind of make this a capital offense, in this kind of a way. And then Yvonne.
A question about the plot of the Gospel of John as we have it.
Yes.
Where does the pericope adulteri, to use your term, occur? Am I right in saying that Jesus has been on the Mount of Olives, has crossed the Kidron Valley going east, and entered the temple area when this takes place?
Yeah, right. So he's just been teaching in the temple area when this is taking place. So it's one, but I'm trying to think of which one time. So he has 3 different visits to Jerusalem in the Gospel of John as opposed to the Synoptic Gospels. So I think it's kind of in the middle. But I'm trying to think of exactly what's happening before or after. So okay, we can look it up. Okay, so those are some of the different ways. So we talk about how essentially glosses could make their way into a text and kind of make it into a new text. How a pericope could get inserted into a text and make it into a new text. Another way will be that scribes frequently will expand an old book. So they'll have an old book on a topic. They kind of like the old book, but they actually don't think the old book is adequate to treat the book that they have. It doesn't treat all the topics, and part of the idea that they have is that they are going to now be an author of a much expanded book that will be more definitive on the topic, and that may correct the book that they end up expanding, or it may, depending on the reverence with which they hold the original text, and how authoritative they consider it to be, they may well silently expand it. So they may have some little text and then they expand it as if it was all written by that authoritative source. So now it maybe was a little Aristotle text and now it's a big Aristotle text. Let's say if they were doing that kind of an expansion. Or if they don't think that the original is very authoritative, they may well just use it, what we consider to be plagiarism, but anyway, where they would just essentially take the words and insert it silently into their own text, and wouldn't know any different because they haven't actually cited any authority within it at all, or where they would have even gotten it. So you can kind of see, anyway, the original text, it now gets embedded into a bigger text, right? Reused. So when we've had past lectures, we did one on Job. One of the things we showed with Job is, if you unroll the whole big scroll here, that there's in fact multiple discrete components in the text as we now have it. So for example, right at the beginning and at the end, there is a prologue and a epilogue that are both written in prose, whereas the rest of it's poetic, and so it's a little strange. You can tell there's a different voice going on. There's also then different discrete components. There's a poem to wisdom. There's the different monologues of Job. There's the meat of the thing, which is Job talking to his three friends. Suddenly there's this Elihu guy who comes in, a different fourth friend who makes all of these arguments that seemingly counter everything that's been said before, because presumably the person who's inserted this new speech doesn't like the conclusions that seem to be being drawn by Job. And then we have God, a poem of God speaking from the whirlwind, an amazing poem, essentially making the same kind of statements that Elihu makes, only well instead of bad. And so it seems hard to imagine that somebody, the person who wrote for example, the Elihu speeches and inserted that into the text would have done so if the God from the whirlwind speeches was already in there making the same exact point much better. So more likely what's happened is that they have the Elihu speech. The person who's a good writer, who's still very dissatisfied, has now inserted this God with the whirlwind speech. And so anyway, there's it's hard to tell exactly what's happened with this text, but it's definitely more than one author, and it's been expanded over time and re-edited and changed. It's kind of a mess, actually, but still an amazing piece of literature. Okay, another one that we're going to talk about is the documentary hypothesis about the Pentateuch itself, the Torah, the 5 books attributed to Moses. And so that lecture is March 12th, so we won't go into it in real detail. But the idea is, we've seen I love the chart, so I always throw it up there. But essentially,
not tonight.
We won't do it. But essentially, it's 4 major texts combined together with a couple different editors in order to get the Pentateuch as we now have it, right? Okay, so we'll talk about that later. Another one that's very unknown but is pretty stark in the New Testament, between 2 different lesser used or lesser known canonical letters kind of at the back of the New Testament. There's this epistle of Jude, which claims to be written by a guy, Jude, who is the brother of James. And it's weird that he has decided to call himself Jude, the brother of James, considering that James is the brother of Jesus. And so you might think, well, why wouldn't you just say, well, I'm also the brother of Jesus, But it's because obviously they had a very different thinking about, in this particular community, about the importance of James, which is much expanded in probably this community, and Jesus. It's also the shortest text of the New Testament canon. At some point or other, the person who is writing the Epistle of 2 Peter has taken that text and has radically expanded it, just taken it word for word in a bunch of places, but other places changed and altered it and corrected it and expanded it, and then claimed, falsely, that the entire new work is actually authored by the historical Peter. So this is a pseudepigraphical text, which is to say one where the person claims to be Peter but clearly isn't, and we can tell, especially because he's using the same words as Jude, and so Jude writing after Peter's already dead. So anyway, so this is an example of how this happens. The most famous, or maybe most important example in the one we've already referred to tonight, which is this the 2-port source hypothesis, the synoptic problem of the first three canonical Gospels. And so essentially the idea is that between Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there's so much overlapping text that is copied word for word from each other somehow that there has to be literary dependence. And so the solution here, as you kind of see, is that the later two Gospels are Matthew and Luke, and that they are each having independent access to Mark and this other Gospel that's been lost. It's called Q, Kvela, the source. And so they independently are essentially expanding those two texts. And so, for example, what happens is if you have Mark and you have this lost gospel, the sayings gospel Q, and Luke has chopped Mark up into little pieces, has thrown a bunch of it away, has put a bunch of it into Luke's gospel, which then is expanded all around it, and interspersed between these sort of narrative elements that come from the Markan gospel. All of the things that are in Q are largely just sayings, and so the sayings then get embedded and create things like the Sermon on the, not the Sermon on the Mount, but the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. So the same ones, then those different sayings get into the Sermon on the Mount from Q in Matthew. And so in that same kind of way, Matthew does the same thing, but just does it in a different order and preserves more. So Mark is not very good at grammar and makes a bunch of other different errors that both Matthew and Luke don't like. Luke likes it less, so Mark throws a bunch more of Mark away, actually doesn't use. Matthew preserves almost all of Mark, but they both correct grammar, and they both, for example, when Mark misquotes the Bible, so the Greek Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, but translated into Greek, the Septuagint, Mark frequently will misquote that because it just means that Mark doesn't have a whole copy of the Bible, and it's just, people memorize this kind of thing. And so you just know those things by heart, but you don't always know it right. A lot of the most famous movie quotes, are
Play it again, Sam.
Yeah, play it again, Sam, or
I'll be back.
What?
I'll be back.
Well, I'll be back is actually a real quote, but the ones like "play it again, Sam," I think isn't actually said in the movie.
Play it.
Yeah, so the actual quote is "play it," or Luke, I am your father. That's not in Empire Strikes Back, right? There's a bunch of those, where the most famous quotes are not actually even said, right? So in that same exact way, anyway, they fix Mark's misquoting because Luke does know the Septuagint. Very good. So, in fact, Luke, for example, is so good at this, so good at erasing all of the seams that if we didn't have Matthew and if we didn't have Mark, we would have no way of knowing that Luke has actually done this. So we wouldn't know that there was this lost sayings gospel. We wouldn't know that there was this Mark because Luke has done this really good job of interweaving it all very perfectly and changing all the tenses and changing, deleting stuff that doesn't work and doing this kind of thing. And Luke's very good writer and very good with the Greek and everything like that. So it's much improved, and so it would be very hard for us to tease this out, and almost probably nobody would believe it. People already don't like the two-source hypothesis, and a lot of people don't even believe in Q, or whatever. They're not convinced by the argument here about Q, even though we have some pretty good evidence for that, and it's the most accepted hypothesis. If we didn't have Matthew and Mark, we would not be able to tell this from Luke, because Luke did a good job. This is Luke's goal, by the way. Luke wrote at the beginning. Because so many people have taken their hand at writing the events of the Gospels here, and because essentially these are so inadequate, I too am going to write the Gospel as I understand it, and so therefore I'm correcting Mark, Luke silently says, and also Q, which does Luke find adequate. Okay, so we have a very different situation than with John, because we don't have synoptic cousins, a synoptic with John, that is to say, right? So John doesn't have these other cousins that we can say, oh, look at how somebody else wrote a John-like gospel using John's source material, or look at this little text which is obviously embedded in John the way Jude is embedded in 2 Peter, right? So we don't have that, and instead we have to try to tease out how the sources grew without that kind of helpful hints. But as we saw with that pericope adulteri, so the pericope of the adulteress, we do think that there are some interpolations into John. Another one that a lot of scholars think is an addition is the beginning, which is such a famous line. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God and the Word was God, is thought maybe to be an early Christian hymn to the Word. And so that maybe that has been a separate poem or text or hymn that has been inserted as a pericope, like the story of the woman taken in adultery. Okay, so the difference, however, fortunately, is that unlike with Luke, whose author is so good at freely editing Mark and Q, changing all those verb tenses, settings, making all these corrections to create a seamless final product, the final author of the fourth gospel left a number of relatively really obvious seams and included kind of obvious errors, actually, even in the edits, where they've made a little edit one place and then failed to make an edit in the next section so that you can kind of see an insertion has happened. And so it makes it a lot more possible to identify embedded or otherwise lost sources, although it makes it more controversial. So Q is much better established than the science gospel hypothesis here. So in the text that we have it today, at end of chapter 20, we read, "Now Jesus did many other signs that, in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." So you may recall I read that before, or a part of that anyway, as the ending of the signs gospel. And it is kind of a way to end a book, So there's many, we'd had all these signs, and Jesus did more signs, but I can't write them all in the book. But anyway, this was the whole point of writing the book, right? And so you may want to have more, but there isn't any more, except for in the book of John there is more, So this isn't the ending of John. There's another whole chapter. So P.S. there's more, So we had that John or whatever as it might have existed, and now there's more. So chapter 21 adds 3 stories. So the risen Christ telling the disciples where to cast their nets when fishing. And so that story is the one that's the most complicated one, possibly in the science gospel. So we already recounted that story before I said about the fishing. The idea of it is, and not sure for a lot of the different scholars say that this is the most controversial one, that possibly that got taken out of place and put at the end at some point at this last stage. Maybe not. Who knows? The second one is Christ counseling Peter, kind of repeatedly and insistently, "Feed my sheep, feed my lambs." You probably heard, fairly famous. You might remember that. And then finally, it ends kind of with a reinterpretation of a previous prophecy that a character here, the beloved disciple, would not die prior to Jesus' second coming. So the idea of a literal millennium, Jesus coming in glory in the heavens, is kind of an idea, a literal second coming. And the idea was that this particular character, the beloved disciple, had been promised or prophesied or predicted, actually like many people in the New Testament, that they would live to see that time and have it literally happen. Well, the problem starts to be when this text is composed, by the time you get to the person who's doing this final redaction, that whole generation has passed away. Everybody's dead. And so how do they deal with the fact that prophecy maybe didn't happen, right? So let's read that story. So after the story ends, and after those stories, anyway, there's a second ending then, and it kind of echoes that first ending. So it almost is like the person has seen how to end a book, and now they're ending it again their own way. But there are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. But Jesus was very busy, apparently, according to the author here, whose second ending kind of echoes the first. So that's the ending of the text as we have it now. So we'll say then, looking at the fourth gospel, it differs, just to get it in a big picture. You can kind of have hit it from the two sides of its components, but let's look at the thing as we have it right now. So it's called the fourth gospel. It's also called John, but John is not John is a traditional name that's been appended to it. Just like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all 4 of the canonical gospels are anonymous, and they don't say who the name of their author in every case, so they're only on the title page that has been added. It differs very much from the Synoptics in content, theological emphasis, chronology, and literary style. So I already mentioned like a 3-year ministry of Jesus instead of a 1-year one. I already mentioned that the temple overturning the tables. The temple incident is happening right at the beginning of the career instead of at the very end, and also there's also multiple trips to Jerusalem. So it's different in terms of what they're saying the events are. In the Synoptics, Jesus also teaches in these short, pithy statements and parables. And by contrast, there aren't any parables in the fourth gospel. So you might think, wow, you could write a whole gospel of Jesus and not include a parable? You know, the guy loves these parables, right? And so one of the things about that is, as a result of that, you need, in order to actually to get to an oral transmission where you're getting all the way back to the sayings that the original teacher spoke, you need to have these kind of pithy sayings where you're saying, judge not that ye be not judged, or something like that. That's easy to remember that I can even recall off my head, even though I'm not the greatest scripture quoter in the world, right? And so the problem with it is if you have like a kind of a longer sermon-y kind of thing that isn't made up of blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, or whatever, all of those kind of things, those are all memorable. Those can all be passed down orally. The kind of statements and the kind of dialogue that is in the fourth gospel is not as likely to have been transmitted that way, because it's more like what you would write down as you're composing a literary text. You going to talk? Some microphone doing something crazy?
Yeah, you can't wear the microphone. And it's too late, but you can't wear it like that.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry, it's off now. Because you can't hear it, but online it makes all sorts of noises when you move.
You're fired, Pastor.
Okay, I won't wear this again. I'm not supposed to wear it. I'm supposed to wear a jacket.
Yeah, you're supposed to wear a jacket also.
So dressed down for you guys today. It's very casual.
Infants aren't thrones.
Yeah, this is my podcast. All right. Okay. So traditionally, as we mentioned then, the gospel was attributed to an eyewitness disciple of Jesus who's named John, so that's why we call it the Gospel of John. The disciple has then traditionally been equated with somebody who is an actual historical person. So we don't know in every case, if we have a literary work that's written generations later, we can't be sure, that we're talking about historical people. We have to actually kind of have something that's an eyewitness account in order to kind of get a sense of it. Well, our earliest Christian writer is Paul. Paul, we do have texts that he himself wrote, and he himself tells us in his text that he met, for example, Peter, and he met this guy, James, the brother of Jesus, and he also met John. And he says this in his letter to the Galatians, and he says it in the relationship of how he had a big fight with them and an argument with them. And he refers to them as the acknowledged pillars, as he calls it, of the church, which is essentially say the leaders of the Christian community that has existed in Jerusalem. And so in that sense, those are people that we understand are early leader figures in just the first generations of Christianity after the death of Jesus. And so those are real people. But this equation of the Gospel of John with that is not historical. That's traditional. So the tradition further makes an equation between a character in the fourth Gospel here, in this Gospel of John, this character called the beloved disciple, that the book's author. So in other words, the idea is the beloved disciple, who's a character in the book, is actually the author of the book, that author is the same as this historical figure, the Apostle John, and that therefore the Apostle John is often referred to as John the Beloved, because he takes then that name of that beloved disciple. However, if you actually read the Gospel of John, when it talks about the beloved disciple, it never once names that beloved disciple as John. So that is not a case, and also the text doesn't actually say that the disciple is the text author. It has an ambiguous phrase that people have read that way, but it actually almost certainly doesn't mean that. So we'll read that. So at the end of John here, again, in that appended on at the end chapter 21, after the first ending of the book, and it comes back, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. You could just say John if it was John, but they don't actually know. The author here of this chapter doesn't actually know what that disciple's name is, because it's not written in the book that he's editing. So, we're going to debunk the Da Vinci Code in a couple weeks. We don't know the name. I just want to say. So it's not Mary, because Mary's in the text otherwise. She's a character otherwise, probably. So the only character in the text as we have it who is named and then is also has this beloved title and is possibly. So what happens is that Mary, who you're talking about, says to Jesus, Lord, the one whom you love has died. You were supposed to come here and heal him, but the one whom you love has died.
No, it's Lazarus.
Lazarus. And so then Jesus raises Lazarus. So some scholars have suggested, well, maybe, and that's when the character is, I don't think they have the character before that, and then after Lazarus is raised, we have this, the one that Jesus loved, the disciple that Jesus loved. So it's possible that is not convinced the majority of people in any sense. But anyway, so it's one possibility is that Lazarus is the disciple that Jesus loved, but otherwise it's just unknown. So Lord, they saw Peter seeing this guy following him, and he says, and he was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? And Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. Right? And so then this goes on, though, this text then, and says, so the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? So in other words, what's happened here is that this is the disciple. Okay, I'm sorry, this continues. That's just the end of the quotation. I'll just read to the end of this chapter here, or the end of the section. This is the disciple who is testifying these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did, and if every one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that was written. So that's the ending. So I already read that part to you before. So here's the thing. So this is this idea then is that the author here is the beloved disciple. But what it actually says here is that as he's talking about the beloved disciple, he then switches from, we know that his testimony is true. So we, the guy who's writing now, who's definitely not that guy, knows that his testimony is true. So in point of fact, it's not, the author here is not the beloved disciple, but he is saying that he believes that the text that he is editing was written by the beloved disciple. But there's no reason for us necessarily to believe him, because he doesn't even know what the beloved disciple's name is. So anyway, we definitely know then, though, that this is the phrase that is normally used to give John the Beloved authorship of the text, but in fact, what it's actually saying is that the author who's writing the words here is not the beloved disciple. Okay. So the author of this text, we believe that the text, this we guy, believe that he's revising that text that had been written by the unnamed beloved disciple. And he's having a problem because although there's a general belief that this beloved disciple had been promised that he would live to see Jesus return in glory, he instead has died. And so the new author here is reinterpreting the prophecy kind of in a very apologetic way in order to try to explain the perceived failure of prophecy, right? So people in the community really believed that this beloved disciple would be among the many people who would live to see Jesus coming, and none of them did. Okay. So we'll mention then again then that the actual text of John is anonymous, and although then the author believed that he was revising something written by the beloved disciple, that's not widely held now. And in fact, most scholars believe, based on just how the narrative of the text works, that there's no eyewitness component to the text. And instead, then, as we've kind of now approached this running all the way backwards, but we're kind of now going to get to the end and put the cap on the whole thing. Instead, we probably have a text that is expanded at least twice. So we probably then, or we may be then, or likely, a lot of scholars have argued then, that we're starting with an earliest component, the signs gospel that I kind of outlined for you at the beginning, and it was meant to argue, it was written by somebody who wanted to argue that a series of signs proved that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was the Christ, and then also includes, I kind of have this as a dividing line, also then includes a kind of a full account of Jesus' passion and resurrection, which might be drawing on a broader passion tradition, but which is revising it to say that the whole cause of it is because of Jesus doing all these signs, right? Okay, and so from that, then that's expanded significantly by an author who is a very, very subtle theologian, and it will be a different lecture when we go into what this guy, we just simply don't have time to go into this guy's thought a lot, but his scholars often call him John 1, although it should not be equated anyway with John the Apostle, but just anyway, a member of this John community, who argued what I'm calling here is a fully spiritualized eschatology, which is to say this problem that these early Christians are having when a lot of the people had been believing in a very literal second coming. They had been believing, this kind of phrase that's inserted into the Synoptics, "O ye men of Galilee, why stand you looking, you know that this, that the same, Jesus will come, in power and glory in the heavens," right? And so many of you alive many alive today will live to see this event. Well, they didn't live to see it, and so now people are having to reinterpret how do we understand that, and so John has definitely decided that this has all been misinterpreted by taking it all very, very literally, and instead it should be understood not physically, not literally, but it should be understood spiritually, it should be understood metaphysically, and that Jesus, that people are alive in Jesus and have eternal life in Jesus here and now, spiritually and eternally, quite apart from the physical reality, which, as we kind of have seen when we've done, like, for example, Plato and Platonism, how Plato was talking about the material world as being quite unreal in comparison to the metaphysical or spiritual world of eternal truths and forms, which exists eternally. And so people are part of that through Christ as far as John is concerned here, John 1 is concerned. So this first expander of the science gospel. And so the end, he says, essentially is not coming literally in the future, but it's already realized metaphysically here and now. And so there's all kinds, we don't have time to go through it all, but there's all kinds of sayings then in this very theological text of John that's inserted here or expanded here by John 1. Jesus, for example, his life, in his expansion of the text is, no one who is alive and has faith will ever die. So he's not predicting only that the beloved disciple is not going to die and will be around, forever or whatever, but it's also that everybody who is spiritually born again in Jesus is already participating in eternal life, right? And this is true because, again, having that new birth, the believer has already passed from death to life. So they are already in that spiritual life. And faith in Jesus then gives the spiritual believers then a rebirth. Flesh can only give birth to flesh. It is spirit that gives birth to spirit. So that's where we are now as far as John 1 is concerned. However, so we took that other one. So now expanded again with that new ending tacked on the back as we saw, but then also a bunch of different little edits throughout the whole kind of text. John 1's text is edited and expanded by John 2, or he's sometimes called the redactor for some of the scholars, who is a much less subtle editor who very much believed in a literal second coming. So he got a hold of John 1's text and he's like, whoa, this guy is totally wrong. He's not talking about all the things that we should be talking about. He's not talking about the kind of physical sacraments that we need to be doing. It's not even in here. And so we need to be talking specifically about not Jesus being the water of life or the bread of life, but rather that you need to actually physically eat bread and wine in order to, in the form of the Eucharist, in order to go forward. It's not just a baptism that is a spiritual baptism that transcends John the Baptist's baptism, but you must be born of water and the Spirit. So the water and it gets inserted by John 2 in order to re-physicalize all of this. And John 2 very much believes in a literal second coming, his explanation instead is lots of scoffers think that it isn't going to happen just because it hasn't happened yet. Oh, it's coming, So instead of saying that there isn't going to be any judgment, that's already occurred, he says again, there's judgment's coming. And so the text ultimately contains a bunch of edits and contradictions as this last redactor re-enters theology of physicality, a literal second coming of Jesus, and recarnalization of John 1, not John 1st, the first editor's theology. And unfortunately, the edits are kind of clumsy. So, although John 1 believed that the beloved disciple then was never going to die because he'd already received a true metaphysical, spiritual rebirth in Christ, John 2 was a literalist who had to reinterpret that statement in light of that disciple's physical death. And so likewise then, his edits reinsert physical practices, baptism, Eucharist, for the spiritual life envisioned by John 1. And so, in sum, when we look at this text, the fourth gospel exists in the canon. It just has a very complex text, but an even more maybe complex history. Its composite includes a bunch of different perspectives. Different verses contain teachings that ultimately actually contradict each other if you take them out of context from each other. But together, one of the things that is interesting in the whole is that what we do see is that the different Christian communities had very, very different perspectives, and there's actually a dialogue that's happening as the different ones are arguing for their own interpretations, theologies, and beliefs. And so, the science gospel. I apologize to everybody online for my noisy microphone. Evan and then Glenn.
Two requests.
Yes.
Can you repeat your distinction? No, definitely not.
Back to the beginning. Slide one.
Repeat your distinction that you made between signs and miracles, and couldn't you bring up the screenshot of the 7 signs?
Oh, the 7 signs? So we will flip back slides for a second. It's way back. There's other fun slides back there, so we can always go back to this too. Okay, here they are. So these are the 7 that scholars identify. The difference between, the difference is words. So the Synoptics use the word miracle, but obviously the Greek version of that, which is like what it was. I don't know Greek again, so it's like dynamis, yeah. And then whereas the Science Gospel uses, and John used this word sign or semia. I'd have to go back to the Greek to do it. And so it's like semiology, right? And so what's the difference? The difference, they're both envisioned here as being divine interventions into what's happening around you. I'm going to argue that this is not the same as our modern conception of the supernatural, because we have separated out natural from supernatural in modern times. Everybody believed often that maybe everything is actually happening because of the gods or gods functioning in the world back then, and so these are not anything out of the ordinary in that sense. They're out of the ordinary in the sense that they're causing wonder. They aren't what you would expect was going to happen. You'd expect that somebody with leprosy was going to continue to be a leper, and that sort of a thing. And so it's a manifestation of wonderment. The words used are differently. I was suggesting that in the Synoptics, miracles could have any other number of purposes. The miracle isn't necessarily being done that you will know that you will know that Jesus is Christ, although that could be a result. It may well, I was suggesting, be actually a active, for example, charity, as you are perhaps healing somebody and welcoming them into the community. In this case, we have the explicit, on the Science Gospel, we have the explicit statement of purpose by the author about what the signs are for, which is the signs are done that you may believe that Jesus is the anointed, or in the English version of the Hebrew Messiah, or the English version of the Greek, the Christ. It's all the same. Glenn had a question. Can we get the...
Just in terms of bibliography, for the theory regarding John 1 and John 2, is there a particular author that you were relying upon that you would recommend?
Yes. Randall Helms. We'll have to add the book. It's the beautiful little text. It's one of my favorite texts. It's called "Who Wrote the Gospels?" And Randall Helms puts out has several chapters on the particular theory about Science Gospel, John 1, John 2. He has his own take on it, so he actually goes a lot further into this, and so gives you a lot more. He has theories about where each of them are, so he thinks that there's reasons why we could say that the Science Gospel was probably written by a Jewish Christian in Alexandria, why the John 1 is probably also an Alexandrian theologian, and why John 2 is part of maybe the Johannine community in Ephesus that is also composing, for example, the John letters. And so I think that that's his overall additional details to it, and so it's a very interesting case.
A follow-up question would be regarding the motivation for presenting the Science Gospel and then almost basically contradicting what the Science Gospel is saying in terms of what the evangelist is writing, or John 1 or 2. Because on the one hand, the Science Gospel is basically written saying, these are these miraculous signs, now you need to believe. And yet all throughout the text as we read it, he's saying, but it's so much better if you believe without seeing any of this stuff.
That's right. It's such an interesting thing, right?
And so you sort of think like, well, are the people that really could witness to this, they're dying off, there are no eyewitnesses anymore that can attest to the Science Gospel, and yet it's entrenched in the tradition of the community, so maybe the reason is,
I think that's a good theory.
Is now what do we do? How do we get people to believe? It's a very charismatic motivation.
I like that as a theory. So that's again part of these, like you say, one of these very interesting contradictions within this text, which is kind of at its heart, if we believe this reconstruction, is this idea that the whole thing is about a Science Gospel is where it starts. And yet, like you say, as time goes on and the text is bigger, there's all these times where it's saying, stop asking for signs. What do you want all these signs for? It's better if you don't have a sign and believe. How much better is it if you didn't get to see a sign and you believe in my name? It's almost like the people who got to see the sign are, they're assigned a worse place in heaven because even the Gentiles would believe that. Everybody would believe that, right? So it is kind of an interesting thing, and so maybe, like you say, it's because all the eyewitnesses have all been dying out, and that's the concern. I think that one thing that what's happened is that this original gospel is revered in John 1's community, so it's something that has been there. A lot of times it's an early text. A lot of times, if that's the center and the central focus of your worship, just because like a new gospel has maybe come in where you're starting to see Mark. So Mark is also known in Alexandria or has come to Alexandria from maybe Syria. And so that's maybe where the passion overlap is happening. And so maybe without being literally dependent on Mark, maybe the guy doesn't really like Mark, like, again, the authors of Luke and Matthew don't. And so maybe the goal is to say, hey, I can take this thing that's been near and dear to my heart, but I'm actually kind of a smart religious leader in my own right, because clearly John 1 is a very sophisticated theologian. And so maybe the goal has been to reinterpret this important text for his community, but in a new, more sophisticated way. And the problem then, once we get to John 2, why does John 2 then take this Alexandrian book and what almost could be, I would kind of have characterized it here as like do a hack job on it. But because the text has maybe now been taken by the Valentinians, taken by Gnostics, and has been taken to be totally spiritualized, and so maybe now has gone on a path that what now is the emerging proto-Orthodox community is going to find that the text is unacceptable. And so possibly the goal here is to kind of bring it back into the fold and to say, no, this is important, but we just have to fix the errors that exist in the text or something like that. And so, I mean, that might be the motivations for each of the individual authors for why they're doing that. Come on.
Why is the miraculous catch of fishes the third of the public signs repeated in the epilogue?
So the idea of it. So this is the most controversial of them. So at the end, I think in the text it actually says this is the third time that Jesus revealed himself to his disciples, and the idea of it in its new location in the epilogue is that that means the risen Christ revealed himself for the third time. But the scholars here, and they put it in brackets because they even say this is way more hypothetical, is that this idea is that this has been displaced. So that had somehow existed earlier in the text, but that John 2 has taken it and put it back there, possibly for whatever reason. And so it's been moved, and so it's out of order. And the reason why they think it's third is potentially because of this phrase at the end. This is the third time he'd revealed himself, and so possibly, essentially that's like the third sign, right? And so then that's the kind of thinking about taking that one. Other scholars. So one of the things that happens is when you're taking a text like a science gospel, let's say, and there's 7 signs maybe, you maybe feel free to reorder them. In some cases they say this is the first sign, second sign, but if they didn't say that, you may feel a little free to reorder it. We do know, just looking at how Q, for example, is embedded in Matthew and Luke, it's well thought that Luke is actually preserving the original order of the Q document because it's a little weird the way the order all is, but whereas Matthew has taken different sayings that are kind of semi-related to each other and pieced them together in order to create great sermons like the Sermon on the Mount. And so Matthew clearly felt able to reorder the document. So it's not in the document as he got it. And so he sliced it up into pieces and he put it into there. It's definitely in different order from each other. So Q is in a totally different order in Matthew and Luke. And presumably because it's just sayings, they felt able to reorder it. So the question here is, did John 2 feel able to slice his document up and reorder it a little? For some reason, that's the argument that the scholars here are making with this list. One more, and then we'll get to urgent.
You've illustrated your talk, your lecture tonight with iconography.
Yes.
Who is the iconographer? Is he modern and a Westerner?
These are the Eastern Church's icons. So the Greek Church, and I just did because I think that they look more. I like them better. So my options pretty much are if I'm going to use either Greek icons or I'm going to use Western Renaissance paintings. There's some medieval. You could also do medieval illuminations, Western illuminations. The Greek ones look more ancient to me, and so I just had picked those. But in fact, what's happened is that the Greek East, the iconographic tradition, became very stylized. And it also became very fixed in a particular way, and so that's why the Roman soldiers, they're all dressed, as 6th century Byzantine soldiers. So there's very, very like the Roman emperor, and everybody. They're always dressed in those kind of 6th century times. So they're not contemporary. We don't have any contemporary images. So the earliest images that we have of any of this kind of stuff are 4th century. And the 4th century ones the guys look just like what you think of Romans. So Jesus does not have a beard. He's wearing a toga. He's got a healing staff and things like that. So he looks just like Asclepius or something like that. So we just don't have anything that goes all the way back. So urgent.
I have a question about the Q.
Yes.
Does the scholar say anything about what is the main? Is there a main message in the Q which is different than Mark,
yes.
Lucas, or Gospels, or more or less the same thing?
So the question is, how do we understand Q and Q's purpose? And so Q is also widely thought to be an early document, an early gospel. It certainly has to be earlier than Matthew or Luke, since Matthew and Luke get hold of them. Q has a bunch of things where the sayings or teachings of Jesus are about agricultural and peasant stuff, as opposed to later talking about things happening, like maybe in Luke, in the cities. So Christianity quickly becomes a phenomenon of Greek cities, but it initially is coming kind of in the countryside of Galilee. And so in that sense, people think that Q maybe is getting closer to the historical Jesus, although of course it's still written in Greek, whereas the historical Jesus would have been doing his preaching, in Aramaic. So it has gone through a oral tradition and then made a language jump. I'm trying to think of the main point of the Q sayings. In some sense, there are some similarities. There is still an apocalyptic sense. There is, though, in general, obviously, an idea of Jesus as teacher and making an argument in terms of against prudential wisdom, in terms of actual, let's say, ethical wisdom. And so not making a case as a prophet might, where he says, "Thus saith the Lord, you must do this or be destroyed," but rather making arguments like, "Consider the lilies," so where you were actually doing these those kind of preaching. And so the primary focus of the gospel in Q, which then extends to the Synoptics, is Jesus talking about what he's calling the kingdom of God, and which is to say and uses the word there, kingdom, which is the same word in Greek as Roman Empire, right? So we live in an empire that is the empire of this earth, that claims to be an eternal empire, the eternal Rome, but in fact is unjust, that is built on violence and soldiers and that sort of a thing. And instead, we're wanting to have an upside down kingdom where, in fact, it's the meek and the poor that inherit the kingdom, and the last shall be first. And so I think that's probably the core of what Q has. Mark Mark is more apocalyptic than that, and then Matthew and Luke are related because they use Q a lot. Bogdan. And then.
What accounts for this divinization of Jesus throughout time?
Yeah. So there's that's a big difference, as Bogdan is mentioning. So we have a much more in Q. It's supposed to having a real divine Jesus, where where essentially we have a divine being who is walking among everybody. It's a much more we're seeing much more a human Jesus, the teacher. Q at one point says that Jesus and John the Baptist are sons of the divine Sophia, which is to say holy wisdom, which is the divine feminine name of God. But as opposed to what ends up happening in the fourth gospel, in John 1's expansion of the signs gospel, right? So essentially, the Jesus of the signs gospel is a wonder worker, a sign worker, a worker of different miracles that are showing that he is, the Messiah. But that then is expanded to becoming a divine man, or the God's self, as far as John 1 is concerned. So this very high Christology that occurs quite early, but is occurring maybe in Alexandria, John 1's expansion. And so the sayings that John 1 then introduces into the text are all of these I am sayings that Jesus has. And so, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the resurrection and the life. I'm the bread of life. Anyway, all of those I ams are quoting, God in speaking to Moses, right? So I am that I am. So essentially, Jesus, at every one of those I am, Jesus is saying, I am God. And so that is already there. So what accounts for it? We already have a pretty realized Christology in Paul, who's our earliest writer. So Paul is very much not concerned with Jesus the teacher, but he's definitely concerned with Jesus being God's only begotten. As we already kind of talked about with, for example, and also in Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria, so earlier in the first century, we did a whole lecture on this Jewish philosopher / theologian, whose entire theology essentially is bringing Platonism and making essentially Jewish religion and Platonism one. And one of the core ways he's done that is by talking about the divine logos, the divine word. And so it was very much a precursor, as we saw, for the divine word, the logos that is embedded in John 1's expansion of the Signs Gospel. So it's already floating around in Judaism, as we see in the first century, and certainly someone like John 1 is going to be aware of Philo, and that's that's influencing his thinking. Okay. Well, thank you guys. We can continue to discuss all these things over snacks, and thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining.